Give him one more minute. Yeah, we are on time. So we are going to actually start on time, and for the latecomers who are going to miss our wonderful commentary, that's their loss and your gain. So to everybody, I'd like to say thank you very much for being here at the Global Conference on this Tuesday and coming in for a very strong, relevant topic, particularly after lunch, and a very strong lunch panel. Today we are discussing the topic, is the Pacific future happening now? The question is, what does that mean? And the Pacific future means that that is where the future of the world's economy is. The majority of the world's population, the majority of the world's middle class, the majority of the world's trade is along the Pacific Rim. People don't really think about the fact that the Pacific Rim, when you look at it, is a tremendous all-encompassing area that for a very long time, due to the size of the Pacific, due to the incredible difficulty and time in crossing it, it was considered this great barrier to close relations, to trade, to investment. The stories go that when the Chinese had their great fleet in the 1400s, there were rumors that in the 1300s and 1400s they might have managed to make it to the Pacific coast, to the Americas, but everybody knows they made it to Africa. And the sense was always that it was always easier to go through and around Africa or through the Middle East for great connections. That is no longer true. We are in a world of jet planes. We are in a world of instant communications. And in fact, there has been statements that have been made coming out of Washington, coming out of East Asia, that all recognize the fact that the Pacific future is essentially becoming the Pacific present, that there is a rebalancing, a reorienting out of Washington. President Obama has made a point of saying that the Pacific has to be the priority. And in fact, one of the key things that has come out of this is that we are now looking at a situation where there is a major trade agreement that has been in the news lately called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a trade agreement that in fact already has 4 signatories, none of which is the United States. This is a situation where other countries in the region have actually considered a priority. One of those key countries, who happens to be represented right here, is Singapore. And in fact, that change in dynamic, the change in dynamic that is being led by the emerging world power in China, who I'd argue is actually the emerged world power, who's just realizing how powerful they are, is creating a different balance. And as Europe's economy stagnates and the Pacific economy grows, we will hear more and more about what we are talking about today. Joining me today on this panel, starting from my far right, but not far right politically, despite what he claims, or does not claim, is David Dreyer. Congressman Dreyer was, as he put it, a man who gave 1/3 of his life to Washington, D.C. He is chairman.
No, much more than that, actually.
Yeah.
Much more than that. 1/3 of a century.
1/3 of a century. Sorry, you're right. 1/3 of a century. Yeah, actually, more than half his life. 1/3 of a century.
So far. I hope it's about 10% of my life.
Yeah, very wise man. Yes. Yep. Very well put. So, he is in fact based here in Los Angeles, but shares his sage wisdom around the country and around the globe. Here, he is chairman of the Annenberg-Dreyer Commission, and in fact, currently serves on John Kerry's Foreign Policy Advisory Board, where he advises the Secretary of State on a number of key issues. When he was elected to Congress in 1980, he was one of the youngest members of Congress, indeed one of the youngest members of Congress going pretty much at any time. And that means that he is still young enough to kick my tail if I get further things wrong about his past. Next to me is the ambassador of Singapore to the United States, Asha Kumar Mipuri, who I hopefully did not butcher it too much.
Perfect. You got it right.
He is, in fact, was previously Singapore's ambassador to Indonesia, High Commissioner to Malaysia, and High Commissioner to Australia. And, in fact, served as Director of Policy Planning and Analysis for Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And just in case you have any doubts about his international credentials, even beyond all of that, he actually spent some time after he went to school in Singapore studying in London and studying at Harvard. We are very happy to have him. To my left is Dominic Ng. Dominic Ng, in addition to being the man who is chairman and CEO of East West Bank, which is essentially going back to being the largest Los Angeles area-based bank.
Not yet.
Not yet. Going back to. It's not there yet, but give it a little time. He is, in fact, a man who is at the forefront of some of the greatest investment trends and investment activity back and forth between the United States and China. And East West Bank is among the 25 largest banks in the U.S. by market capitalization. And in addition to that, from 2011 to 2014, he served as chairman of the Committee of 100, promoting mutual understanding between the United States and China and advocating a collaborative partnership between the two countries. And his insights will be very welcome on this panel. To my far left, but not far left politically, is Stefan Seelig, who is Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade at the U.S. Commerce Department. He's Executive Director of the President's Export Council, which puts him in an excellent position to talk about what's going on in Washington. However, I will note that in addition to all these activities he does, including Executive Director of the Travel and Tourism Advisory Board, serving on the board of OPIC, and Commissioner for the Congressional Executive Commission on China, he also happens to be a recovering banker who was at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So he has insights from both the public and private sector, and we're glad to have him on this panel as well. The first question that we really want to ask is, right now, why is this region so important? And most importantly, what do we define by important? What is the emerging element that is making this region so significant? David?
Well, thank you, Kevin. Let me first say that as we talk about, is the future now, I'm reminded of two events that took place for me 31 years ago. 31 years ago, I was in this hotel introduced by Mike Milken at one of the predecessor meetings to this. So this is technically, it's been 31 years since I've been coming to this effort. And that same year, 1984, I was sitting at Sunnylands, the place where Xi Jinping and President Obama met, the home of Ambassador Walter Annenberg. And he had just returned from being ambassador to the Court of St. James in London for President Nixon. And think about this, 31 years ago, Ambassador Annenberg, I was a young congressman then, looked to me and said, David, the future is around the Pacific. I've just come from across the Atlantic, but the future is around the Pacific. And I think that there are many people who obviously are recognizing that, but when you, Kevin, mentioned this issue of importance, I was just talking with the ambassador about his sort of boss, the foreign minister of Singapore, who when I met with him in Singapore a year and a half ago, we were talking about the problems in the Middle East. And obviously that's what was in the news. The devastating loss of life in Syria was very prominent in the news then. And the foreign minister of Singapore looked to me and said, what's most urgent is not always what is most important. What's urgent is not always what is most important. And I think that it's important for us to recognize the importance of this region. President Obama has very wisely engaged in this pivot, focusing attention on it. I strongly support that, believe that it was a great decision, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I do believe that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will be the single largest free trade agreement in the history of the world, it'll be transcended when we do the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, TTIP, but it'll be the single largest free trade agreement in the world among these now 12 countries, and I personally would like to see it expand to a number of other countries. I mean, we're hoping that Taiwan and South Korea and Colombia and I aspirationally, if lots of changes were to be made on the issue of state-owned enterprises, would like to see China as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership ultimately. But that in and of itself is, I think, going to play a very key role in putting the kind of attention that needs to, because these 12 countries today, Kevin, comprise 40% of the global gross domestic product. And it has the potential to become even bigger as the TPP expands.
And that's in that alone, that number, that 40% of the GDP, that's not even just counting expansion, but also the fact that some of these countries right now, if you just look at the sheer size of Indonesia alone, let alone the size of Mexico and some of the others, these are among the world's largest countries by population. Indonesia is in the top 5. It is.
Indonesia may actually be larger than the United States. There's some who believe that it is, because with 16,000 islands, it's kind of difficult to do a census, you know, as effectively as we do here. And so they report like 270, close to 300 million people.
Right,
I mean, it is
so
huge.
It in fact could pass us up, and it has one of the great emerging middle classes. And that in fact brings up a key issue that I want to talk about with the ambassador, is that one of the things that we keep talking about is this rise of this global middle class. Southeast Asia in particular is home to some of the fastest emerging middle classes. What exactly is going on in terms of consumers, in terms of the people in the region in which you are so thoroughly located?
Well, first let me say some things about why the Pacific is important. Because, you know, the population size, the demographics, that potential is over there. And I think we should be looking at India being very much part of this movement as well, because India is tied up with many of the things happening in Southeast Asia, and with China, with India, with Southeast Asia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, you're really looking at more than 3 billion people in terms of demographics. And in terms of geography and economic integration, that's what's happening. It is not just TPP that we speak about, we will speak about more. There is ASEAN, 10 countries, more than 600 million people coming together to make our economies much more closer. And there's a regional comprehensive economic partnership, which does include China and India, but does not include the US. But most importantly, the Pacific contains the 2 greatest countries in the world today, the US and China. That by itself makes the Pacific very important. And in this, the fulcrum of this is actually Southeast Asia. In terms of the geopolitics, in terms of the geoeconomics, it becomes a place where everyone from around the region, whether you're Southeast Asian or not, really gathers. We've got the growing middle class, we've got an educated population, and we are pulling the whole economies of these 10 countries together, that it could then fit into all the other regional integration sort of processes taking place. So that really is what I see happening in the foreseeable future.
And that's a very significant element of the future that we need to be aware of even here in the United States.
Kevin, can I just make one comment on that middle class point that you've just made, which is obviously these countries are so large already, and the TPP markets represent roughly 800 million consumers, which is about 40% of the global economy. But even more profoundly, if you look out 15 years, by 2030, they are going to represent 3.2 billion consumers in the middle class out of a total global population.
Just the TPP countries?
Just the TPP out of 4.9, which is, to put it in perspective, 9 times the size of the United States today. And so it is not just the market power that has been referenced here today, but this is where the money and the consumers and the buying power is going.
But the reports are also that the Chinese middle class is going to move from 200 to 600 million people,
well,
like over the next 5 years.
Let me just add a point here. Actually, it's interesting about the statistics, because by 2030, actually, just just China and India combined will be 40% of the consumer market. Just these 2 countries. By the way, neither one of these countries are in the TPP, though.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Right. Well, and as we'll discuss, in fact, let's bring that up. China is not currently part of the TPP negotiations, Dominic. Yet, China is the other great power of the Pacific. In matter of fact, China is more focused on the Pacific than the United States is. Why is China not currently part of those negotiations, and why do you think it needs to be?
Well, from my perspective is that I I looked at the Obama's policy of the pivot to Asia, while it's a good idea, but I always looked at it as that in terms of a Greek nation like U.S. should not be looking at this rising economic power of China in terms of a zero-sum game. U.S. ought to look at it as that we're the big brother in this world. We are not only the most important, economic power in this global world, but also from military point of view, political point of view, and so forth. And U.S. ought to be the leader that continue to help direct traffic, basically, for all the different nations around the world. I actually look at TPP, from my perspective, is unfortunate because it should actually include country like China for discussion. Obviously, there are issues in China such as, from the U.S. standard like human rights and then corporate governance and environmental issues and all that. But these type of issues,
SOEs,
yeah,
obviously. That's
SOE,
key.
obviously, but these are the issues that obviously
State-owned
are the critical issues that ought to be put on the table for discussion and negotiation, instead of like, sort of like putting China on the side and say, well, you shouldn't be part of that. And I looked at it as that from that perspective, we ought to look at it as that if U.S. do want to enter into agreement with 12 nations, and I think there's nothing wrong with it, and it ought to be, so the message ought to be in a way that does not look like that it's trying to isolate or antagonize, like China.
Dominic, can
If I
I
can just come in?
Sure, please.
Oh, sure.
So the TPP is meant to be an inclusive agreement. But you come in when you're ready. Because I mentioned there are a number of economic integration things going on, ASEAN, RCEP. The TPP is 12 countries out of an APEC grouping that have self-selected to say we need to move on to higher standards. The intention will be once we get this thing done and we consolidate and sort of settle into this, it's a complicated negotiating process with 12 countries. Singapore already has an FTA with the US, and David was very significant in making sure we got that ratified. It was complicated for a small country to do with the US. With 12 countries, think of it in sort of far more complicated. What you need to see all these integration elements is as Lego pieces. We're putting them all together. They're all open to someone else coming in. And China will eventually, as a member of APEC, be able to come in, but we need to create those standards because we are ready to move forward first. There's Indonesia, very large economy. They're not ready to sign on yet, nor is Philippines. So the idea is not to leave somebody out, but to be practical about negotiating a forward-looking agreement that sets the standards. Then everyone says, let's move up to those standards.
I think that's absolutely right, but to Dominic's point, one of the things that has concerned me, and I've spent my life in politics, is the sale of First Trade Promotion Authority, which is pending in the Congress now, which will allow Congress to have a direct up or down vote on TPP, and we hope TTIP before too terribly long. Part of the sales package of this, sadly to me, something that I never really wanted to engage in, was to point the finger at China. And I think that Dominic's point is right on mark, as is the ambassador's, in saying that the Trans-Pacific Partnership should be inclusive. Not to count my own pieces, but 2 years ago this month I penned a piece for the Wall Street Journal in which no one had talked about the idea of China being part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I referenced state-owned enterprises and human rights and these other areas of concern. But China had, up to that point, been a very strident critic of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I was very pleased that just before Xi Jinping and President Obama met at Sunnylands for the first ever retreat between the leaders of our two countries, we actually did see some positive statements being made from China on potential ascension. But remember, when I wrote this 2 years ago, and I still believe today, this is only, Dominic, got to be aspirational because, as the ambassador says, those standards have to be met. Right now, Japan is dealing with this, and we're going to get into Japan, I suspect, here, Kevin, before too terribly long. But all of the country, there are areas of dispute that need to be resolved. China's is a very, very, very heavy lift but we should still aspire to do it.
But to me, David, this is one of the most important parts of TPP, which is if we get TPP done, I think this will in fact cause China to accelerate, or likely to cause China to accelerate some of the changes they're going to have to make in their economy because of the sheer power of that economic bloc.
Totally agree.
And so if you think about the things we talk about transparency, rule of law, of becoming a responsive stakeholder in the global economic community, this is something that they are going to have to do.
I just wish that my former colleagues would not spend all their time demonizing China and saying, we've got to pass TPP to screw the Chinese. I mean, I hear that with regularity, and I just don't think that's...
If you look at the Wall Street Journal today, you know, in the front page, even today, I mean, the quote from Obama is that we got to pass this so that we do not have China to take over.
Yeah, I want just.
So why don't you read?
I'll just share it right now. Is that yes? In fact, it's a quote that made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. President Obama says, if we don't write the rules, China will write the rules out in that region. We will be shut out, American businesses and American agriculture. That will mean a loss of U.S. jobs. So the president is outright saying, look, China is already actively engaged and involved in this region. He's not saying China is evil. He's not saying we're trying to hose China. What he is saying is that the U.S. is going to be left out of the conversation.
Well, what he is saying also is they currently have 17 free trade agreements in the region. And so this gives them a tremendous leg up, and their companies a tremendous leg up to sell their products and services without tariffs in the region, where U.S. companies fundamentally are not playing on a level playing field against Chinese companies currently.
Well, I think that's what I think all these points here are totally well taken. I think my point is that in terms of sending message out to the public through the media, it's always been zero-sum game.
Right.
Using zero-sum game as the way to present it so that there is that threat. So we better make sure we do something. Yeah. We better make sure we exclude them because they are getting ahead. I think that is what I call the wrong way of presenting ourselves as the greatest nation in the world.
I argue that if we treat China like an enemy, she surely will become one.
Yeah.
And it's a balancing act we have to face, is that China isn't currently treating the United States like an enemy. China is treating the United States possibly as a rival, possibly as a... But there's a distinction. If we want a country to treat us like an enemy, we have a few other choices out there.
But maybe as the one member of the administration, I can say some good things about China. Because I've been to China more than any other country in my short stint as undersecretary. They are currently our second largest trading partner and our third largest export market. Last year we had a record level of goods we sold to the Chinese market of $124 billion. Record levels of FDI, which is one of the fastest growing sources of foreign direct investment in the United States. And all of that supports roughly 800,000 U.S. jobs. So what we are doing with China is actually very important to the success of our economy and our country.
And that's very important from the region's point of view as well, because the Asia Pacific does not want there to be something that excludes either China or the U.S. in any process. We benefit a huge amount from trade, tourists coming from China, trade and investments coming from the U.S., and the relationship between the U.S. and China is fundamentally important for us. And so the calmer it is, the better it is for us.
To the Secretary's point on FDI coming from China, my Professor Pei, who's going to be, we're with the Warm-Up Act, he and Mr. Wang, Heng Chi-Chen's brother, are going to be doing the next panel specifically talking about China. But I think the important point that the professor made to me just as I was walking into the room is this tremendous flow of capital from China to the United States today. And that's not only due to the fact that there are opportunities that exist here in the United States, but because a lot of concern that exists in China as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, a couple things that come up on that. One other thing in terms of China that's an issue in Chinese capital is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. And Dominic, I know for you consider that to be a significant institution that the U.S. is not currently involved in. What exactly is involved in it? Why should we be involved? I'd actually love all of you to comment on this.
Well, I think from my perspective is that, again, if you look at the IMF, clearly, even in 4 years ago, President Obama he himself was concerned about, the IMF need to have a better corporate governance structure, and we need to make some necessary reform, and he had actually presented that proposal to Congress. But again, the U.S. Congress weren't able to pass that very simple resolution because the emerging countries are getting bigger, and so rightfully, they wanted to have some proportional increased share of the vote. And I think currently, my understanding as IMF is that I think U.S. get about a little bit over 17% of the vote, in addition to that veto power. And let's say Japan has about over 6%, China 3.8%. And so what China wanted is to get it up to like a little bit over 4%, no, a little bit over 6%, I think it's a little bit over 6%, that's what they're trying to get, which is sort of like get a little bit more proportional share of what they deserve. And then the rest of the emerging countries, I think they are trying to get up to like a little bit over 42%, which they feel is the appropriate, output comparing with the GDP and so forth. But it's a very simple proposal that makes perfect sense, but IMF weren't able to make that change because to a certain degree, Congress have every right to control that. So with that in mind, and then you add that TPP that China couldn't get into it anyway, so naturally this infrastructure investment bank kind of makes sense. Now, but I do wanted to point out though, quite frankly, is that currently the projection of infrastructure work that is needed in Asia would exceed $8 trillion in the next 10 years. So in that regard, there are plenty of work that need to be done. And with Asian Development Bank being such a small bank today, and even including IMF and World Bank all combined together, all three of these entities are not going to be able to handle all of those potential infrastructure work that need to be done anyway. So I think having AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, makes a lot of sense. And frankly, as you can see today, 57 countries are already sort of like signed up to participate. So I think that this should be a good start because when you can build roads, when you can build bridges, when you can build port, that's the best way to help those countries to expand in terms of economic output. That's the best way for to create jobs.
AIIB does have 57 partner countries in the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. The Asian Development Bank has 67 countries that are members of that. It primarily focuses on the issue of poverty and other issues there. It seems to me that when you look at the other countries that are today looking at potential membership in AIIB, and again, Professor Pei reminded me as we were coming in that the startup costs and our involvement would be great, but I do think that we should aspire to be part of AIIB. I would like to see the United States in AIIB because, obviously we have tremendous infrastructure challenges here as well that need to be addressed. And I will just say for full disclosure that I've advised the Secretary of State on this as a member of his, Foreign Policy Board.
We won't hold that against you.
Well, since Singapore is a member of the AIIB, and we joined very early on with all the other ASEAN countries, because, as Dominic says, there are very important infrastructure needs in the region. These infrastructure needs are not just national, but many of them connect the region better. Railways, ports, and the Chinese have also laid out something called the One Belt, One Road strategy, which is to really connect Asia a lot closer. So when Singapore and the ASEAN countries joined, the reason we joined was because of this, and because as Singapore being a very significant financial center, we wanted to work with them on the governance standards, and we wanted to make sure that they are linked up with other multilateral development agencies. Those Lego bricks I spoke about in trade also apply in the development world. How do we link AIIB up with the World Bank and the IMF and the ADB? I think that's really what we should be looking at. And David will, of course, advise better, but I do not think Congress would have anyway given you the funds to join AIIB at this stage, because it does require some capital input coming in.
But that's why I use the term aspirational. I think we should talk about it. I think we should let the Chinese know that it's something that we would like to be able to do, even if Congress would not engage in those heavy startup costs that it would entail for us to do it. I get right now there is interpretation that the United States, for geopolitical reasons, may have said no, and I think that is a mistake. I think that the cost, if there could be an understanding that the cost is playing a role in it, not a desire to not be part of this thing, I think that would be very beneficial.
Well, I think what the administration has recognized is that there is a pressing need for infrastructure investment in Asia and in the rest of the world. So that's clear, and does welcome participation in multilateral institutions, including the AIB, provided that they live up to certain high standards. And those institutions that do live up to high standards, we are going to welcome the opportunity to jointly work with those institutions to fund projects.
And I want to change tacks for just a moment now, which is that China is obviously the main focus in a lot of ways, but either outside, inside TPP, or otherwise, and with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But there are other key players in the region, and it's worth taking a few minutes to focus on those. Now, Japan. Japan is a key country, a key player, and it's been dealing with a stagnant economy for what seems to be decades now. And Abenomics has been an effort to basically create a stimulus in the local economy in Japan. How important is Japan as a player, and what's going on?
Well, Kevin, first of all, I mean, as we know, this marks the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And tomorrow, history is going to be made when my former colleagues on the floor of the Congress will, for the first time ever, have an address to a joint session by a Japanese Prime Minister when Shinzo Abe is there addressing this group. You know, right now, there are challenges that exist in the region far beyond this. The conflict that exists between South Korea and Japan, which is a long and historic one, is one that needs to be resolved and continues to be a real pressure point. There are conflicting views as to whether it was good or not to bring Japan into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. My friend, the former president of the World Bank and former U.S. Trade Representative Bob Zoellick, has argued that as you grow an effort like this, you diminish the prospect for closing the deal. And I think that he's got a point there, and that's one of the concerns with Japan. I have lots of friends in Japan. One of my former staff members has just left Japan. She's been there for the last couple of years. And I was talking to her about this issue, and the point that she has made is that while Abenomics has gotten this great deal of attention, it's not been nearly as bold as many people had initially thought. From my take, the boldest thing that could be done would be for Prime Minister Abe to stand up to the agriculture interests that exist in Japan and are really the greatest hindrance to the closure of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if he were to be able to stand up to that interest and bring about closure, that would be, I think, the boldest action of Abenomics that could be taken.
But it probably couldn't, David, get done without the conversation around TPP politically for him. And the reason to dare to be great to include Japan is, of course, because it's the third wealthiest economy in the world. It's already our fourth biggest trading partner, our second biggest source of foreign direct investment.
I was just saying, when the debate was on as to whether or not to include them, that was part of it. They were just concerned that they might not be able to close it.
In fact, the excitement on TPP came after Japan joined.
No,
Before that, when it was still first the P4, and then the US came in, and then you had Malaysia and everyone coming in, it didn't pick up that much excitement until the Japanese came in, the world's first and third largest economies that actually have been trying to do some sort of trade opening deals for a long time.
30 years ago, remember, the word was that Japan was taking over the whole world.
Yeah, and 30 years, since we're looking back 3 decades, I looked at a speech that Lee Kuan Yew gave 30 years ago in when he addressed a joint meeting of Congress in 1985, titled Peace and Prosperity in East Asia. He had already presaged many of the things we are trying to do today. It's taken us 30 years. We haven't moved quite as much as I think he would have hoped, so let's hope we get this done this year.
By the way, we should extend our condolences to Mr. Wang and to you, Mr. Ambassador, for the loss of Lee Kuan Yew. I had the privilege of hosting him on 2 occasions in the Rules Committee in the Capitol, and he was an amazing visionary and someone who provided a great deal of advice and counsel to a lot of us.
I think that, Kevin, my perspective is that I think Japan's biggest challenge really is 2 things. One is the debt to GDP ratio, which is highest among all the developed nations. And then secondly is the demographics, the aging population. To me, I think that is so much more, the severity of these 2 issues is so much bigger than anything else. And if you look at this aging population in Japan today, in 1995, I think 5 workers support 1 retiree. In 2005, 3 workers support 1 retiree. By 2020, it will be 2 workers support 1 retiree, which is just 5 years from now. And then 2030, 1.25 employee support a retiree, and it's just not sustainable. I think that with this type of the current aging population, and with Japan being a country are not by culture are not willing to take on new immigrants, and birth rate is not going to be high because people do not have high confidence that they will be able to support the kids, and I think that there's just major reform need to be taken place in Japan. But for the last 20 years, the reason that if you look at the GDP growth, it's basically pretty much right down near 0, despite all the monetary stimulus the central government, the central bank has been doing. Every few years it's going to be another sort of new finance head or new prime minister coming in and then start doing something. They couldn't get anything done because they'd never done the fundamental structural reform that is needed.
But also one of the real problems is the aging population. That's the other thing that is gets so much attention. And to me, there is a simple and clear answer to that issue, and that is immigration. And one of the things that continues to drive me is this free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people. And Japan has historically had this very closed economy, obviously on the tariff side, but also on immigration. And in dealing with that aging population, if Japan wants to continue its strength, there has to be a greater flow of immigrants coming into Japan.
I'll give you an example. India, 1.2 billion people today. The median age is 27. It's not one of these, like a high GDP per capita kind of country. However, a lot of aspiration about the future, because when you have a very young demographic, nation, the likelihood of growth is substantially better, than a very much aging
That's
population.
why Indian immigrants having the prospect of some going to Japan could play a role in strengthening Japan as well.
Although Japan's solution in trying to stimulate activity for the elderly is to build robots and invest in that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, any further thoughts on what's going on with Japan?
Well, look, obviously, the Prime Minister is there this week. I think it underscores, for all the reasons David suggested, the strength and importance of the partnership. And I think when you have the opportunity to try and join the 1st and 3rd largest economies of the world together, that will fundamentally create the power behind TPP and hopefully give it the impetus to get done.
Thank you, Stefan. It was just then the other country, flipping around to the other side of the world, I want to bring up is Mexico, because Mexico is the 3rd largest trading partner for the United States. It is a fast-growing country, and it is one that we don't really think of in terms of the Pacific, and yet it is a key player. It's involved in the negotiations for the TPP. What's going on exactly with Mexico, and is Mexico really looking towards the Pacific, or are they still looking more regionally or otherwise?
Mexico and our trade relationship with Mexico has been a huge success story since NAFTA. Despite all the noise around that agreement, it's gone from something like, what, $50 billion of two-way trade to over 500. And its importance to the region is unparalleled. In fact, Mexico exports more manufactured goods alone than the entire Latin American region. Which is extraordinary given where that economy was not too long ago. And if you look at all the changes that have taken place, it has largely, I think this was part of the point that the ambassador was making around the ASEAN nations, is it is so closely linked to their participation in the global economy. It has geographic proximity to markets, namely the big one up north for them, which is extraordinarily important. I was at a panel earlier today And one of the panelists said something which actually struck me, which is, geography is everything for nations, and they have the benefit of that geography, which is being a border state with the United States. They have a large, skilled workforce, and importantly, they have 12 free trade agreements already involving 45 separate countries, which is more than any other country in the world. And so this is the export part of their economic development has been extraordinarily critical.
Also, to Kevin's question, though, you talked about FDI, Stefan, coming into the United States. FDI from China into Mexico has been very, very strong as well, as has been the case with other countries in the region. And so Mexico, by virtue of this flood of capital that has been coming from Asia, along with other country, Colombia has been another real beneficiary of lots of Asian investment as well, has really tied them not just to the Pacific but across the Pacific.
And it's no longer the sort of goods that I think many people associate with them. So Mexico is already the leading producer of refrigerators and flat screen TVs in the world. They are the largest exporter of beer. They are the 7th largest auto manufacturer in the world. And they are one of the largest providers of IT services. So it is an economy that is diversified broadly and has become globally important.
And thanks for including beer in there, by the way.
Yes, absolutely. But the point you made, my apologies, that Mexico actually developed and got on the cutting edge of being an electronics manufacturer years ago. And what we forget in terms of NAFTA, and we forget in terms of a term that we fortunately don't hear anymore, maquiladora, was the fact that a lot of electronics from Asian countries were being assembled in Mexico for sale in the U.S. And it's worth noting that these plants that were built were not replacing U.S. plants. These were in fact replacing Asian plants, and they moved them over specifically for sale. And one of the other key issues that's come up in terms of auto manufacturing is that because Mexico is far ahead of the U.S. in terms of free trade agreements, there's been actual discussions by the Koreans and by others to build plants in Mexico, not for sale to the United States, but instead to manufacture in Mexico and then sell to Europe or other parts of Latin America.
I think that whole issue of the platform is a really, really important one, because, I mean, getting back to Dominic's concern, which I share about demonization of China and all that sort of stuff, the fact is, if you look at goods movement, the idea of being able, and this is when we had these agreements, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, as we pursue the free trade area of the Americas, and the NAFTA, which Stefan mentioned, as we look at those things, they all do play a role in ensuring that we can have products for the U.S. consumer market that are developed within this region, which is, again, a positive that can create greater competition.
Yeah, with the maquiladora, treaty that was set up way back, in the 80s. In fact, that's what the Japanese has been setting up all these manufacturing plants over there. And I do feel that, as you said, Korea, China, one by one, they will be, setting up more and more of those manufacturing plants over there, and then which in fact will keep Mexico going for many years to come. So there may be different nations, rising and then falling, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be a nation who's taking advantage of this vast U.S. consumer market, and then taking advantage of the current infrastructure has already been so well established in Mexico, and continue to use those facilities and the people that have been doing those jobs, and then that will continue.
Now, and it's not just Mexico, by the way, which is attracting a lot of that investment. Historically, over the last couple decades, Thailand has been served as the global hub for computer hard drives and various other elements. Indonesia has increasingly attracted a great deal of that investment. Ashok, what's going on in terms of your neighbors, in terms of why are they being so particularly successful in attracting this kind of manufacturing, and not just for the region, but for export around the world?
Well, there is a phenomena of just lower cost, lower manufacturing base. As Mexico did this 30 years ago, the cost structures have changed, and that keeps making countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam very attractive to foreign investors. Labor costs, land cost is much cheaper. But there are still challenges in Southeast Asia. We have to get the infrastructure right a lot better, so that will help countries that want to invest, companies that want to invest there, export their goods. There is a certain rise of economic nationalism in some of these countries that have to be dealt with. And that's why in the region we're trying to create a wider economic community that allows countries to take advantage and learning from each other. What does it mean to create better investment climate? What does it mean to create a better trade facilitation? So it's not all rosy. There are challenges to deal with, but I think that these countries have the right direction. They need to get jobs for their people.
But Kevin, I think the ambassador is far too modest on this topic, because the World Bank ranks the ease of doing business in markets around the world. And the #1 country in the world in terms of ease of doing business is Singapore. And equally as importantly, it has in this area 3 of the top 4 and 5 of the top 10. So they are doing a lot of things right.
But we need to spread that sort of knowledge in the region. That's really the key that we want to do. We've moved on to a different scale. And some of the manufacturing have moved on to much more higher value-added manufacturing in Singapore. And that's Singapore's next direction, using data a lot better, using technology a lot better. But how do we get the region to move on forward with us? And Singapore actually has invested in industrial parks in Indonesia, in Vietnam, even in China, that helps to transfer some of that soft technology of manufacturing, industrialization into these countries as well. And that's been what we're trying to do.
The ambassador mentioned twice now one of the TPP partner countries that we had not brought up at all. And I would like to bring it up, and one other, to realize that we're talking about all these difficulties and problems that exist. But as you, in your nice introduction to me, pointed me, it was the beginning of time that I joined the Congress so long ago. But at that time, I talked about the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and obviously the end of the Vietnam War took place 40 years ago, and this is the 20th anniversary of normalization of our relationship with Vietnam. And there are very positive developments taking place there. I just had the privilege a few weeks ago of joining Howard Dean, who serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute, the former governor of Vermont, presidential candidate, leading the Democratic side, and I was leading the Republican side. We engaged just 3 weeks ago in the first party-to-party talks, spending a week in Vietnam, talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a wide range of other things. And I believe passionately in the interdependence of economic and political liberalization. And we are seeing some very, very good signs in Vietnam. Similarly, back when I began in the Congress, what was it that was always in the news when we looked at Asia? It was the struggle of the Taiwan Straits between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. And I know that President Ma in Taiwan has had more than a little political difficulty, but one of the greatest things that he did, and I first met him when he was mayor of Taipei, was that he has really made great steps towards breaking down the barriers, clearly commercially, between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. So I use those 2 examples of Vietnam and Taiwan to say that as we wring our hands over the dispute over the islands between Japan and China, and the clash with South Korea and Japan, there are still very, very positive developments that have taken place in the region over the past few decades.
And David, can I tie that back to the TPP conversation? Because obviously Vietnam is a potential participant in TPP, and this will be the first trade agreement.
Well, they're going to sign that thing no matter what.
There you go. This will be the first trade agreement that ever has substantial environmental protections and labor protections. Those are going to be so important in that particular market. And this has to do with wildlife protections, illegal trafficking, work conditions, forced labor, et cetera. And so to be able to have those sorts of standards in the corpus and body of TPP to allow Vietnam to begin to make those changes in their economy not only has commercial implications, but has profound implications for the world.
Just to add one more historical anniversary, today is the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon in 1975. Yep. And that galvanized the rest of the region, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand, to sort of move forward and do things together, and in many ways to turn to the U.S. and say the U.S. has helped us in this future. And the U.S. connection with the region is not something new that we're speaking about. It dates back to the Second World War, it dates back to the Vietnam War, and we've always seen the U.S. as an active and resident power in the region, whether for economic reasons, for political reasons, for geostrategic reasons, and that's what I think the region wants to see continue.
And Indonesia is another great example. I mean, I've described Indonesia over the last 14 years of its democracy as taking to democracy like a duck to water. I mean, here you have the largest Muslim population on the face of the earth. You have what is either the third or fourth most populous country in the world, right at where we are. And they obviously have lots of problems, but they have done a phenomenal job in their move towards political pluralism, the development of the rule of law, and self-determination in Indonesia.
Now, one thing I want to do, and just bringing things back around full circle and just talking about the TPP, is that one thing we haven't really talked about and really does need to be brought up is the issues with TPP back here in the United States. And there are a couple different prongs to that. One is, David, as you mentioned, is the Trade Promotion Authority issue. But another is that there have been a number of concerns, not only in terms of economic nationalism and concerns about free trade, but also about the fact that the extra-governmental structure in the courts in TPP, an issue that's been brought up a lot, is whether or not it is too in favor of corporate interests. What exactly does that mean, and what is actually going on in terms of the impact in Congress, and why should people be concerned, not be concerned?
Well, I mean, you want to go ahead, Stefan? I'll take. I will
you
take.
could do the Congress part, and I'll do the administration part.
I'll take on the tough issue. I mean, regularly the issue of our sovereignty being given up in trade agreements since the beginning of time, really with the North American Free Trade Agreement going back to 1993. It's always, we're ceding our ability. We're going to have foreign countries come in and sue the hell out of us and do us in. And it's always ended up being a very specious argument that has been made. The United States of America is not going to be giving up its sovereignty under under any of these trade agreements. And there is a very passionate commitment to it. You know, we did, Kevin, at the outset with the exchange that Dominic and I had at the very beginning. I mean, I'm very concerned on the politicization of this demonization of China. And I know that, I don't challenge anyone's motives. And as I say, I'm an American before I'm a Republican. And but I'm always uncomfortable with some of the statements that have been made about, how it is that we demonize someone in our quest to have success here. So I think that at the end of the day, I believe that the Congress is going to be able to get this Trade Promotion Authority through, and I think that we can get the votes. And I congratulate President Obama. He made a very strong statement when he was sitting with Prime Minister Renzi of Italy the other day in support of this effort. And there are a group of former members of the House and Senate. We've been working closely together out promoting this. And I think that it is going to happen, and I think it demonstrates that we can, in fact, see some things get done in Washington. I had to leave before they could get it done, but I think my departure may have enhanced the opportunity for success that they're going to be enjoying.
All right.
Well, this specific thing that you're referring to is this investor-state dispute issue, and I will start off by saying the United States has never lost one in the history of any investor-state dispute claims. So to me, it's a bit of a head-scratcher about why people are so exercised about this topic. What I would say around trade promotion legislation is, obviously, as you know, a bill has come out of the Senate Finance Committee last week. It's come out of the House Ways and Means Committee last week. So hopefully we are beginning to make progress. But I think, having traveled the world, including to Hanoi, and talked to various interlocutors on this topic, I think it is so important for us to be able to signal to our negotiating partners that we are serious about getting this deal done, so that we will allow them to put their best foot forward in terms of what deals that they may be able to make. So whether or not we are able to do TPA without trade promotion legislation, I don't know. But I know for sure.
You mean TPP without
trade promotion legislation. But I know for sure that in order for us to get the best trade TPP done, we are going to need trade promotion legislation.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, just 2 points on first the TPA. I think that much as the negotiating countries, the other 11, would like to finish a good deal, I think that without the Trade Promotion Authority, we probably will not finish TPP.
Yeah. Well,
people are not putting their best deals on the table because they need to wait.
And we shouldn't.
We don't want to be driven by what the U.S. Congress, and it's a domestic issue you have to deal with, but it is the reality of life.
I would not blame a single country partner of TPP for not closing a deal if they don't have Trade Promotion Authority granted by the Congress to the President.
And on investor state dispute settlement, ISDS, you know, I'm like Stefan, I'm befuddled by the issue. Because are you concerned of your companies suing our governments or our companies suing your governments? And Singapore already has this investor state dispute settlement in many of our FTAs. We have it in the US-Singapore FTA. Looking at USTR's numbers, the US has never lost a case. In fact, there have been 17 cases under the investor state dispute settlement that have been brought up in US FTAs. There have been at the same time thousands of other cases that your corporations sue your own courts. And this is not even, it's an arbitration procedure that countries want. And I would like my companies that are investing in the US, if the rules of the road change, to be able to take this up for arbitration, because our companies are going global as well. So it's a two-way street. And your companies want the comfort, the rule of law that this provides to them. And in many ways, it depoliticizes it. It's much better for the corporation to go and take this up with the government, rather than go back to their own government and say this becomes a political issue between you.
I think that is a political issue that actually is more technical, that the vast majority of the voters, those who watch CNN and Fox and MSNBC and so forth, don't have a clue about it. The biggest issue really is going back to is labor, environment, and then there's a lot of concern. I mean, because the reality is that any kind of free trade agreement, while in totality, it does create jobs and it helps promote, help countries to move forward. The reality is that there are going to be jobs who will be displaced. So it's getting back to a domestic issue. One particular state that have heavy manufacturing jobs that will be highly likely that may have their jobs displaced, and then that particular state would have to find a way to,
new opportunities.
Come up with new opportunities. And then, our education system has to be improved so that we'll be able to train our workers, our workforce, to move on something else. But I think that is a big fundamental issue here, that when you have, a partisan country, there are special interest groups who are promoting any specific, whether from intellectual property protection rights or to certain other corporation getting more access to these other partner countries, it will cause worries for certain segment who said that, well, what about my job? Because after all, for some of these workers, I mean, the only thing matter most is that how do they feed their family? And then so those are kind of issues always going to come up.
Kevin, since you went first full circle on the issue of TPP, could I move just a little bit beyond that circle back to China, where we were? And just
so you know, we've got the warning. We're gonna need to start wrapping up.
Okay. Well, I just wanted, when I was listening to Dominic, it reminds me of the last time Dominic and I were on a panel, and you know this. It was specifically on a motion picture that my colleague Bill Mundell is working on now. We're working together on this, and the goal is a very simple one. This picture is designed to shatter the myths that exist in China about the United States of America, and to shatter the myths that exist in the United States of America about China. We've got a two-time Oscar-winning director on this thing. We're hoping to have it come out soon, and I just wanted to express my appreciation to Dominic for the help that he's provided us on this, and I think it's going to be
as we know from yesterday, Dominic is already an expert on film financing.
Yes, absolutely.
So the main thing I want to do at this point is that, looking forward into the near future, or the Pacific near present, as we should call it, what are the things that we should be looking for in the next few years? What's the main thing that we should be aiming for as a positive? What's a potential goal that the U.S. is aiming for, that business is aiming for, that Singapore will be dragging us kicking and streaming towards?
Look, I don't know how I could say anything else other than the successful completion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would allow U.S. companies to participate and play on a level playing field with this extraordinarily important, large, and as I started off saying, growing market. And importantly, with the success of TPP, as David referenced earlier, have that then be a lubricant and a segue towards the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. And between both of those trade agreements, they would cover 2/3 of the global economy.
Right. Thank you. Dominic?
Well, I'm looking forward to U.S. to continue to believe in our great nation in terms of always stepping up to act like the true leader. And I think that my perspective is that, the last few months on the AIIB incidents, I think it did not help U.S. to look like the real leaders. When we try going to talk to all the other countries and discouraging them for joining these infrastructure banks when everybody else are joining anyway, and I think that make U.S. look like that we are, afraid of other countries getting ahead of us. We're way ahead of everybody. There's no need to worry about, whether China gaining some momentum in terms of or being the lead of an infrastructure bank, when in fact, U.S. always is the one that's sort of like helping everybody to come together anyway. I think U.S. need to continue to sort of like stand tall and be proud, and not worrying about too much about one nation getting ahead of here and there, and then just step forward and proudly be the leader. And I think as long as U.S. continue going that way, every country will follow.
Well, since I am in Washington, and in Washington the big complaint is the urgent always trumps the important. The TPP is urgent. Let's get it done before we sort of get distracted. There'll be other things that have to come, other bridges that have to be crossed, but let's get TPP done.
Great.
I'm here to say session is over, and that's my role here. But the only thing that I would, just in closing, a lot of people we're marking all these anniversaries. This is also approaching the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and we know the flashpoints that led, the very, very delicate situation that led to the First World War. And there are potential flashpoints in Asia that could lead to very great difficulty. And I think TPP is going to be an important part in diminishing that threat. We need to continue to remain vigilant and looking at those challenges.
Well, a happy anniversary is Singapore's 50th anniversary this year.
That's a happy birthday, Singapore.
Yep.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.